Hey, welcome, this is Jelle, growing bonsai, and today we are working on a pine. And not just any pine, and not just any video. In this video I will spend a full year cycle on wiring a pine, unwiring a pine, and pruning back, and the why and the how. But before we go there, one question to you is, what do you prefer? Short videos with detailed techniques and then that's it? Or longer videos like this one where I share a technique but also the outcome? Let's see what I had to say about this tree last year. And it is blowing with lots of wind, so there might be a little bit of noise. It's the end of the season. I'm going to unwire this pine. It was wired 1 year ago. Now, pine branches do not fatten up all that much. What you can see here is that the wire is still not being swallowed by the branch. This part is still okay. However, if you look here at this branch, you see that the wire is almost at exactly the same level as the bark. That means that this wire is on too long. The same at this spot here, you can very clearly see that the branches start to really grow around the wire. This is a very bad mistake on my end. So what I'm going to do now, for thin copper wire like this, I'm just going to unwind the wire from the branch here, just by looping it back. Here it is important that you hold one end of the wire and unloop the other to avoid scarring the branch. Now you can see here, this is perfectly smooth bark. There's no damage whatsoever. This was in perfect time. Let me grab this end and zoom in on the more scarred area. This wire is also getting to the point of the thickest that I will still be able to unwire without doing more damage to the bark. We're getting to the place where it has really started to affect the bark, and what I now do is really lift it out. Make sure that you don't twist the bark. Always hold on to the branch that you're unwiring, so not to break or twist the branch too much. And you see the little groove that has formed here because of the wire being left on too long. However, if you look at the rest of the branch, there's only very slight indentations. This will grow out within the season. This will take 2-3 years to disappear. So maybe over time I'm going to have to go with this side branch and a little bud that sits here. And as said, this wire has been left on for over a year. That shows you that wiring a pine can mean that your tree is in wire for a very long time, because these branches might not have completely set yet. Now, how long do you have to leave a wire on the pine? This depends very much on the vigor of the pine, the extremeness of the styling that you've done, and basically the fattening of the branches. Wiring is of course done to put a certain shape in branches, position the foliage in certain places, but pine has very long, flexible branches. Now, when to unwire is very subjective. It needs to be in time so that there's not a lot of scarring happening on the branches, but also not so early that the branch just veers back in its original shape directly. I know that there's people who say, oh, you leave it on this many weeks, but that's actually not true. You can't predict it. You can't predict how quickly a branch will swell, but there are certain phases of the year that branches swell a lot. That is after the first 6 or 7 weeks of the growing season, so mid-spring. That's when all the southern branches can swell a lot on many species. And at the end of summer, as the tree is preparing for winter, you can also expect a radical increase in thickness. Now, by thicker wire, it is good practice to use a wire clipper and just basically clip the wire in consecutive places on the trunk so that the wire just breaks and comes off. I'll leave some of the branches and the tension wire on the trunk and the main connections of the branches so that they don't veer back all that quickly, but most of the wire comes off now and will be rewired in a month or two. So I've now removed all the wiring of all these branches except for a wire here, and here. They're quite heavy wires, and with that they will keep the main branches in place, but you can see the shape of these pads has reasonably well set. What I'm also going to do in this session, I'm going to pluck off all the old needles. The main reason for removing part of the needles is of course weakening the growth, redistributing energy. Let's have a look at what I'm going to do when it comes to plucking and cleaning. This is a nice example branch because you see a couple of things that need to be done. This here is a little stub that I left when I initially pruned the branch during the styling. And then if you look here, you see this is a 3-way split. Now I don't like three-way splits. I only want two-way splits. So I need to look which one am I going to keep. Now this has nice fat buds, but it is a fairly long distance to the first side branch here. This is a much shorter distance, this is a much shorter distance, so I'm going to remove this one, which incidentally is also the thickest branch. Removing this increases taper and increases ramification, so I'm going to clip this off. Now I'm going to remove all these old needles that sit here on the branch at the base. This way I'm opening up this branch for more air circulation, more sunlight. I've got two buds here with lots of needles to feed them, two buds here with lots of needles to feed them. Typically here at the bottom I would like to leave a few more needles than I'd leave on top. So yeah, this is all done for now and ready to be wired later on. And this basically is how I go through the whole tree. I just remove a lot of needles. I might leave one or two needles higher up to encourage backbudding at those spots. Just like that. But thin it out enough so that this branch doesn't get a lot heavier than the rest. Side branch, lots of healthy buds here. So I can thin this out a little bit more. It is nice and strong. Also again ready for wiring. Mind you that this work is of course for more mature pines, and you don't do it on pines that are so much in development that you really need to thicken branches and that you really need to get lots and lots of backbudding here. I have a lot of buds in the places where I need them. I do want some more backbudding, so I will fertilize heavily to help that, but I don't need to develop the branches itself all that much. It's really about positioning and refinement here. Now this is a very open, light branch structure that I could fairly easily wire out and start positioning. As you see, I've left a few needles on this branch for backbudding. This I think is not going to live, so I can remove it, remove the old stubs. All cleaned up, ready for wiring. Let me finish thinning out this tree for now, and I'll get back to you when I'm ready for the wiring. Well, it's January. Outside it's raining. 2 degrees Celsius, cold. But you can now see that the foliage that was wired in summer and unwired later on, the foliage now has to really take its original position a little bit again, and I can start rewiring it. I'm first going to remove these thicker wires that are still in the trunk, and then I'll wire out the whole tree. I'm not going to bore you with showing you all the wiring, I'm just going to do it. So the wires here on the trunk have been on for 1.5 years, and slowly they are starting to leave impressions in the bark, so it's really time to take them off. I do hope that it sits tight enough now that I don't need to rewire this with the heavy copper wire. And heavy, this is actually only 2 millimeters. Here in the back there's 2.5. And this is not an official bonsai tool, this is just, yeah, it's a bolt cutter. I suppose you'd call it a mini bolt cutter. And I use that on my heavier copper wire because otherwise I break my bonsai tools, which really don't do all that well with old copper wire. When I bent this branch down, it required a lot of force and I used a tension wire. Let's see whether 1.5 years has been enough for the branch to set. You see, it has veered back quite a bit still, so probably a new tension wire is needed. If you now look here at the trunk, you see that there's a little indentation here, so it is good that I'm removing it so that this can bark over properly again and doesn't become a very big mark on the trunk. Now, just as an example, we'll wire this one out. And first of all, I'm going to put not too thick but also not too thin, so medium-sized wire. I'm going to anchor that here on this branch. This will also keep this angle of connection in place. Loop it around the trunk and just wire out this main branch. Doesn't really need a lot of wire, this one, but it does help because this way I can quite easily position the branch exactly in the shape that I want. That being done, I'm taking a little bit thinner wire, which I'm going to connect to this one and that one. And I'm seeing a few small scars on the branches, and I'm going to make sure that I'm not going to use the same direction. So the direction of the wire here was in this way. So this branch is going to be wired in that direction now, so that scars are perpendicular to each other. Most of these have been wired out, and now I can just start positioning them. So from the front I really want this to hang down quite strong, and then slowly come a bit forward and a bit backward and a little bit up. And the same with this branch, it goes down and then it comes back up. And what you can do is now position the individual side branches and create little groups of buds and tufts of green, just like that. Group them, bring this one down and over, so that they start coming together as one individual branch. Same here, all these long branches can now be curved down, and here at the end I can lift them up a little bit with the growing tip. Tiny little wiggle in there. A little bit awkward to do this while the camera is rolling, but you get the drift, right? Let me fine tune this. Now what I've done, I've created a small pad here, and I can of course here remove some of the needles that hang down to give it a little bit of a cleaner look. Then I've created a pad here, and I've created a small pad here in the back. And I've split this hole up into 3 distinct areas. Here the angle is nice and steep. This means that the areas above it I can now also pull down and create the next layer roughly here. Now to get all the buds pointing upwards at the end, when you enter the foliage, you can leave it a little bit more open. Don't squeeze all that tightly, so you make a little loop around all the foliage. Then after you clip it off, after you clip the end off, you can just tilt the bud up using the little loop. So you get towards the end of the branch, and the last little bit of wire you create a loop just at the base of all the foliage, grabbing all the needles, and then you use the loop to position the buds upwards. The branches here are steeper than on that side. Here they're really hanging down, and this is broadly growing out, reflecting the direction of the tree, which is really growing into that direction. Now one of the difficult points of a design of a tree is of course, how do you deal with the top? This branch here needs to come in line with the lower branches, so it needs to come down quite a bit, like this. Then I have this small branch that can fall in here, and here in the back I have a branch that is quite heavy, but will give you some depth. Then what I'm thinking is that this should become the new highest point. This whole branch is quite heavy, and it creates an odd line. It comes up and then it turns to the right to go up into the top here. I don't really like that. So what I'm thinking is reducing this part considerably. In fact, only using 1 or 2 of the small branches in here, putting quite a steep bend here to bring this down, bring this up, and reduce this here as well to just 1 or 2 small branches, which then over time can grow out to fill the back again. So now this angle is the same as this angle. This can still be a little bit steeper. And now it has started to crack here at the junction. So one of the things you can do, if you have to make a very tight bend, you take the wire with your pliers and you just grab it, hold on, and then you bend it from the plier. And I would like to keep quite a bit of foliage here on top. Don't have a lot of branches, But because of the angle, I was thinking making a little yin, but actually there's no use. Just going to cut it flush. Hope that this pine will still grow over it. What I'm hoping for now is that here in this area I'll get new buds over summer. Tree wants to grow up, so chances are that somewhere here new buds will pop. I'm going to wire this out a little bit to the back. And then, yeah, let's see whether the crown densifies over the next couple of years. So keep in mind, developing bonsai, it's a process of years, not of hours. A little bit of a yin. And with that, I think the rewiring of this tree is completely done. Now, fertilizer, sun, letting it grow for a season. Prune it back and then hopefully get a bit more back budding here. Develop the lower pads. Early spring. The tree is doing really well. And now I hope you can also see that everywhere there's candles pushing. I might have to thin them out a little bit. Bring them back to all have the same length, and here in the top there's quite a lot of budding going on that I also need to thin out a little bit, but I'm quite happy with the tree as it is. Now when pruning these pines there are a couple of steps, and the first step to me is always I remove all the needles that are hanging down from these branches. And hopefully what you can see in the video now is that by doing this the bottom of the branches looks a lot neater. They look a lot cleaner and crisper. As pines backbud at the needles, this will help later on reducing the number of branches that you get at the bottom of the pad. So that also means that if you want branches at the bottom of the pad, I normally don't, but that you then leave the needles in place. This is particularly for this species, the Scots pine. Now this is starting to get nice and smooth, and I can do the same one level up, of course. Now I've done this for these pads here, and they look already a lot less unkempt. In springtime I didn't really do a lot of work on the candles, and that is because I styled it over winter, and now that leaves me here and there with triplicates and with candles that have extended quite far away. Normally I don't start pruning just in the middle of the tree, but I do that all the way at the top of the tree. And there's a very simple reason for it. Pines you can only prune back as far as there are needles, so you always have to leave something like 6 to 10 needle pairs at the end. And then if you do that right now in the middle of summer, over the course of fall, new buds will develop at the cut ends, and hopefully, and that's the intent of the pruning right now, you also get some buds on the older wood. Now that means if I start pruning at the bottom and I prune the bottom branches too short and the branch above it doesn't have any needles, then I can't prune that branch at the same length, or even shorter. Ideally I want them shorter. I don't want shading from branches as you go down. This branch should be shorter than that branch should be shorter than the branches below that. That is why it is always good to start pruning at the top. Go as short as you can there. They will grow the strongest anyway. And then as you get lower, where the branches are not as strong and they don't grow as strong, you don't have to prune down as far, but you also have the space left to prune. So this one is going to go all the way at the base, leaving just a few needles attached to some side buds that are already there. Here I have one side bud and no more, so this I'm just going to cut short. Same here. Now you may notice that I am actually not removing any of the needles that sit further back, and the reason for that is quite simple. If you take a needle like this, it is basically 2 needles, right? And in between of these needles, in the sheet, that is where the new bud can develop. So the more needles I leave on at the back, the easier it becomes for a tree to start back budding. Here you see this is the extension, the middle branch that I cut away earlier when I said I'm going to prune at the top. And that leaves us here with 2 branches, both of which have a nice terminal bud forming, and that's a good indication that growth has stopped. And I can just prune these back to, say, 6 needles or so. It's a little bit awkward. I'm going to provide some shade so I can actually make the cut. There we go. And then here at the other side there is only 1, 2, 3, 4 needle pairs, so I'm just going to remove the terminal bud. Now here in the back there are a few needles still sitting, and I'm going to leave them in place so they can get bed budding. I am going to, however, clip off some of them that sit very close to the bifurcation. I still leave 1 or 2 needle pairs a little bit further back. This is where I expect back budding to occur. It might still happen here because I've left the base of the needles. So instead of pulling them away, cutting them will also aid in getting new back buds. Now, because these branches are all wired out still, after you have done all the pruning and cleaning up, you can still do some fine tweaking on the branches to position them exactly the way you want them and get nice tight foliage pads in place. The extension of this year, of course, is not wired, so it does require a little bit of touch and feel to get this right, but this way you can get quite crisp pads shaped without rewiring at this stage. Full of pine resin, but the tree is completely restructured. It has been cleaned out. All these dropping needles are gone. I have pruned it back, removed all the end tips. Then I've cleaned out all the needles that have fallen in the pot. This is important because fungal infections don't stop when a needle drops from the tree. They can still infect the rest of the tree, so take them out. And yeah, I've realigned all the growing tips, and now it can just go back into the garden, gets lots of fertilizer and sun. And with that, I'm going to say thank you for watching. See you next time. Maybe also with a pine.